Good morning. Today we're going to read chapter 4 and 5 of the Orphan of Ellis Island. His neck ached. That was the first thing Dominic noticed when he awoke. He lifted his head from his chest. That's when he noticed the second thing, the darkness. Where am I? He wondered. He stretched out one leg and was startled by a loud bang as his bare foot knocked over against a bucket. The noise and the strong odor of disinfectant suddenly brought the memory of the whole dreadful day rushing back to him. Dominic reached down into his lap and turned on the flashlight. I wonder if they've gone to the wall yet, he said, poking his head out from behind one of the tarps. He pictured his classmates' accusing faces as they searched for his great-grandfather's name, a name he was certain they'd never find. I can't go back with them. I can't go back to the school, he said grimly. In the glow of the flashlight, Dominic wondered what he ought to do next. Then he thought of Dave Santos, his caseworker. Dave had promised to find him a new family, but maybe Dave could find him one today. And a new school to go with it, he thought. All I have to do is call Dave, Dominic decided. Then he remembered that he only had his lucky Indian head nickel in his pocket, which wasn't enough money for a phone call. That's all right, Dominic said to himself with a shrug. I don't need Dave anyway. I can hop on the ferry. His face brightened at the notion. Although he didn't take the time to think past what he would do after the ferry ride, it was enough of a plan that it would get him that far. He stood up and made his way across the dark closet. That's funny, he thought, as he opened the door a crack. It's so dark. He pushed it open a little farther. The bright lights that had been there before had been dimmed. Dominic stepped out of the closet and into the museum. He flickered on the flashlight and took a step to the right, flashing his light across the huge exhibit wall. He recognized the silver escalator. Gleaming in the darkness, it sat silently, moving neither up nor down. And where were all of the people? What's going on? Dominic thought nervously. Taking a few steps forward, by the time he reached the dark display cases, Dominic's nervousness had turned to fear. There was definitely something wrong, dreadfully wrong. It was all too still, too quiet. Where was everyone, and what happened to the lights? Using his flashlight to guide him, Dominic slowly found his way to the entrance doors. He tried the handles, but they were locked. He pressed his face against the glass. To his astonishment, he saw lights twinkling in the distance as boats bobbed up and down over the black waters of the harbor. Oh no, he gasped when he realized that it was night. He pushed against the heavy door, but it wouldn't budge. He tried opening all the doors again, but they were locked. I must have slept for hours, he thought. Help! He shouted at the top of his lungs, hoping someone would hear him, but his shouts only echoed in the eerie stillness of the museum. As he bounced his flashlight beam from one wall to the next, Dominic thought about his classmates and Mr. Howard, his teacher. Had they gone back to school without him? Hadn't anyone missed him? Whether anyone missed him or not didn't matter much now, Dominic realized. What mattered was that it was dark, and he was alone and hungry and trapped in the museum until morning. What am I supposed to do here all night? He thought. Is anybody here? He called out. There's got to be somebody here. Hey, he shouted, can you hear me? Help! As he made his way across the room, his shouts for help became more and more desperate. He called on anybody who would come to help him. Hey, Mr. Night Watchman, help! Hey, Dave, help! Hey, Mr. Howard, help! Hey, Mr. President, help! Anybody help! And finally, when he was sure that no one was around who could hear him, Dominic cried out loud, I'm scared! I'm really scared. Chapter 5. After trying everything he could think of to get out of the museum, Dominic walked up to the still escalator steps to the second floor. He shone a light up at the black and white photographs of immigrant families that hung on the wall. Dominic stopped to read the words below it. An Irish family arriving in Ellis Island, 1911, was the caption. Dominic studied the picture. There was a mother and a father and 9 children. He counted them. To his surprise, he realized that they were all boys. At least 8 of them were. For he wasn't sure about the baby in the mother's arms, even though 8 brothers. Whew, he whistled out loud. Dominic had always dreamed of having brothers, but having 8 would be like winning the lottery. He stared up at the photograph and imagined himself standing in a long line of fair-haired boys. Soon Dominic walked photo to photo, trying on one family after another. He saw himself standing with Chinese brothers and sisters in one picture, leaning against a tall Russian father in another, and in the arms of a smiling gypsy mother in yet another. He spent a long time roaming the halls and the rooms, seeking out faces, imagining himself happily fitting in a single spoke in a large wheel of a real family. His favorite picture was an Italian family. There was a boy with a cap on his head and a sack over his shoulder. Beside the boy stood a little girl and a mother with a baby in her arms. Dominic thought the boy looked like him with his dark hair and eyes. He spent a long time in front of this picture, not only imagining himself as a part of this Italian family, but imagining that this boy was somehow his Italian ancestor. He realized this was a 1 in a million chance, but he couldn't stop thinking, what if? After Dominic had stared at the picture for a long time, he decided to go upstairs to the 3rd floor and see what he might do up there. But as he started to climb the now motionless escalator, a low mechanical groan suddenly rose from the silent steps, and he jumped off. Then, just as suddenly as it started up, the noise stopped. Everything went quiet again, deadly quiet, and it chilled Dominic to the bone. Dazed with fear, he stumbled about the room and bumped into a display case, which caused him to scream out loud. The unexpected noise had shaken his nerves so badly that his teeth had begun to chatter. What's going on? He wondered. Was someone there? Were they watching him? Were they trying to frighten him? Crouching under the display stand of telephones, Dominic squeezed his eyes shut tight and willed his teeth to stop chattering. He sat perfectly still, like a hunted animal, hiding, waiting and listening, but the low hum of the air conditioner was the only sound that filled the room. Dominic stayed that way for what seemed like hours, frozen in fear, until he felt his legs begin to cramp. Slowly, cautiously, he moved out from under the table and finally stood up. Then, without thinking, he reached out and picked up one of the telephone receivers on the display in front of him. An old Norwegian man talked about his homeland. Dominic was filled with such relief that he let out a loud sigh. It was the first human voice he'd heard all night, and even though he knew it was a recording, the sound of the old man's voice was somehow comforting. As he went from one phone to another, Dominic's fear slipped away. He began to pretend that he was actually having conversations with the voices. They were mostly old people, grandmothers and grandfathers, he guessed. He pretended they were his. Soon he began to feel less lonely. But the voices never answered him, and after a while he began to long to talk to someone real, someone who would answer his questions, listen to what he had to say, like a real grandmother or grandfather would do. Dominic's hand reached for the last phone on the stand when the flashlight went dead. Suddenly, he was in total darkness. Frantically, he tapped the flashlight against the table and turned the switch on and off, but it was no use. The light wouldn't turn on. He dropped down onto the display stand. Desperately frightened, Dominic stood trembling in the blackness. His hand searched under his shirt for his familiar smooth curves of his lucky key. What was he supposed to do now? Where could he go? What if someone was out there watching him, waiting for him? Dominic reached back down for the useless flashlight, thinking to carry it as a weapon if he had to. And as he fell over the receiver of the phone instead. It was the last phone on the stand. The one that he was about to pick up right before the flashlight died. He brought the receiver to his ear and heard a kind old voice begin to speak. I came to America when I was a boy of 11 years old. I'm all alone, Dominic blurted out. And nobody cares. Nobody even came to look for me. In Italy, there was very little, and yet we had so much. I don't know what to do. Dominic's voice was choked with sobs. The flashlight's broken and it's dark and I'm afraid. I'm really afraid. My brothers and I all had to share one pair of shoes that we had to take turns to wear. Mr. Howard forgot about me, and maybe my foster family forgot about me too. In Italy, we had a goat. Oh, please, it's so dark and I'm afraid, Dominic pleaded. Please, listen to me. And there was a long pause on the other end. Then, as he stood alone in the darkness, Dominic Cantori heard the old voice whisper, Yes, little one, I'm listening.